There are only a few names in history where you can just say their first name and know exactly who I'm talking about. Elvis is one of those names. With a string of musician biopics released in the last few years, Bohemian Rhapsody and Rocket-man to name a few, it was only a matter of time until they did a movie on Elvis Presley. And I'm all shook up that it took this long. The highest selling solo artist in history has quite the story. Baz Luhrmann took the director's chair for this project and really created a compelling story about the king of cool, Elvis himself. From sneaking into gospel churches to escaping groupies, all the way to addiction, the king of cool had a roller coaster ride, and this movie covers it all. Let's explore the fact versus fiction of what the movie depicts and what really happened. Grab your hair gel and your flashiest jumpsuit, and let's rock and roll. I'm Joey C. Let's go! Growing up, Elvis was a huge fan of Captain Marvel Jr., and he read them constantly as a poor child in Mississippi. In the film, it shows our handsome boy reading the comics and even sporting a Captain Marvel lightning bolt accessory pinned to his shirt. Although Elvis never wore the lightning bolt on his clothes, his passion for the superhero remains true. He had a rather large collection of comic books of the character that still sits in the attic of Graceland. You can even see Elvis's love for the character on display because his hairstyle is very similar to Captain Marvel Jr., also in the famous TCB logo with the Marvel-esque lightning bolts. TCB stands for Taking Care of Business, the name of his backup band. Some even say that some of Elvis's jumpsuits were designed with the superhero in mind. The film shows a powerful scene where Elvis and his friends sneak into a gospel church session with music being the main theme. How they show Elvis's emotional connection to the music being performed in the church is pretty accurate how it actually happened. Elvis grew up in a majority black neighborhood in Mississippi, and he was mesmerized by the music at the time. And rock and roll itself is deeply rooted in African American music, although he was often regarded as stealing African American style of music since he was the first mainstream rock and roller that took the world by storm. Everybody agrees, though, that the gospel music Elvis grew up around planted the seed that created the Elvis we all know and love, unless you hate him.
More on that later.
The theatrics of gospel music with the movement and the hand gestures also made a deep impact on our young rock and roller's mind. Elvis fans know his public persona was centered around rebelliousness. In a time where swinging your hips in a suggestive manner was rather offensive, Elvis did it on national television. Understandably, this made him quite the controversial figure. However, Elvis wasn't the only rebellious one in his family. Elvis might have learned his bad boy ways from his father, Vernon Presley. In the childhood home, they didn't have indoor plumbing. None of this was portrayed in the film, but we do hear a few times in the movie how they were very poor with few ways to make ends meet. We also hear about his daddy going to jail, but we don't hear why. Well, Wikipedia it is. Vernon apparently sold a man a pig and was given a check for $4. Good lord, a $4 pig? Anyways, it said the daddy man altered the check to be made out to be $40. He was of course caught and sentenced to 3 years in prison. He only ended up serving 6 months, and Elvis's separation anxiety from his parents played a big theme in this movie, which all stemmed from daddy going to jail at a very young age. Speaking of separation anxieties, Elvis was very close to his mother. Like any Southern boy is, I suppose. Elvis's mother, Gladys, was a heavy drinker, which Elvis is shown in the movie telling her not to drink so much. Elvis went overseas in the army to avoid charges due to his public indecency charges. It's a long story, you'll have to Google it. Anyways, in August 1958, Gladys became ill while Elvis was away in basic training. He was stationed in Germany. He quickly came home to visit her, and thankfully he saw her just in time. She died shortly after Elvis came home to visit, and she passed away from a heart attack and liver failure due to alcohol poisoning. Elvis is shown very distraught in the movie, unable to talk or stand, which is very accurate. It is shown that Elvis couldn't even leave his mother's closet. Elvis said in real life and in the movie, quote, "She was always my best girl." That is just sad. It is widely known that Elvis's real reaction to his mother dying was very similar to how they showed it in the movie, which makes it even more sad. Rest in peace, to Mama Elvis. In the movie, it is shown that Elvis's evil manager met him during Elvis's performances at the carnivals. That is one of the first things that we discovered was changed for the movie. The film introduces the shady manager as the carnival owner who stumbles across Elvis during his shows and recognizes him as, quote, the world's greatest carnival act. In the movie, the Colonel, as they call him, traps our handsome young man inside a mirror maze, and then onto a Ferris wheel. It's here that the Colonel convinces Elvis he could take over the world and that he could manage the talented young star, which is kind of creepy. In reality, the Colonel had already upgraded to talent management, managing the likes of Tommy Sands and Hank Snow. The truth is, Elvis opened for Snow, and that's how the two became connected. So the whole Ferris wheel creepy trapping thing never happened. And that's probably a good thing, too. One of the biggest things that the film got correct was the interesting history of the Colonel, and throughout the movie, he's shown as nothing short of a mystery. Come to find out, the man wasn't actually a colonel. I know, we're all shocked. And he wasn't even a Tom Parker, which is the name that he told everybody he was. It's eventually revealed that he was a Dutch immigrant that came to America illegally, which explains why he doesn't want Elvis doing international shows, which is a topic often brought up in the third act of the movie. And he claims it's for security reasons. But he couldn't get out of the country because he wasn't a citizen. When the Colonel came to America, he enlisted in the army as Tom Parker, eventually being discharged. But the name Tom Parker stuck, which is another thing that I learned in this movie. I never knew Elvis never played an international show, and honestly, that's just shocking. Speaking of the shady manager, man, it is portrayed in the movie how the Colonel took advantage of Elvis and took most of his earnings. That is very accurate how it happened in real life as well. Although some say that Elvis would not have become who he became without him, it is no doubt that the man squeezed Elvis for everything he had. In the film and in real life, it is known that the shady man himself cheated Elvis out of millions. It was understood that the Colonel took up to 50% of Elvis's earnings. And after Elvis died, the Colonel frauded the Presley account for up to $8 million. But eventually, the man got sued, and the lawsuits started piling up, claiming that the 50% he took was more than the average manager took. Good Lord, that man squeezed that lemon dry. There was no lemonade left. There's an intense scene near the finale of the movie where Elvis learns of the Colonel's past, and while on stage at the International Hotel, not the correct name, another story another time, he publicly fires the Colonel while the audience watches, awkwardly. This did not happen at all, and was thrown into the movie to make the situation more intense. Although, there is some truth to this. In 1973, the hotel he was performing at in Vegas fired a co-worker of Elvis, and that co-worker's wife was suffering from cancer. When Elvis didn't get anywhere with persuading the hotel not to fire the man, he publicly verbally attacked the man from the stage, and backstage after the incident, Elvis and the Colonel got into a shouting match over it, which ended with Elvis firing the Colonel, but the Colonel quit. You can't fire me, I quit. But the story doesn't end there. In order to sever ties with the shady manager, it would cost Elvis and team $2 million to free him from his contract, and eventually Elvis took the man back. It's like a bad breakup, man. And also, like, Elvis couldn't afford a $2 million fee. I don't know, it's a whole thing, man. You just Google it and you'll find it. In another entry that happened exactly how it was portrayed in the movie, back when the Colonel first picked up Elvis, one of the first things he started doing was merchandising. Way ahead of his time, if you ask me. He was kind of the grandfather of modern-day music merchandising. He had buttons that said, "I love Elvis," and he also had buttons that said, "I hate Elvis," because a lot of people, older people mostly, boomers if you will, thought he was a delinquent. Gotta capitalize on those haters, am I right? The Colonel explained to Elvis's mother in the movie that regardless if they hated her son or not, they would still make money, and this actually happened in real life. They sold just as many "I hate Elvis" buttons as they did as the "I love Elvis" ones. Even while Presley was in the army for 2 years, they sold a massive amount of merchandise which turned Elvis into a household name. The idea of merchandise stemmed from Elvis's secret dream of becoming a movie star. So, they decided to turn his name into a brand, which was very successful. On to one last entry about the crazy Colonel. In the movie, it is shown that he signed Elvis onto a 5-year contract with a Vegas hotel in exchange of forgiving the Colonel's gambling debts, because he was known as a degenerate gambler. This is all true, and in the movie, the Colonel had a contract written up on a stained tablecloth, which was also true. The Colonel wanted Elvis to play this 5-year-long gig in Vegas to prevent the Colonel's gambling losses from ruining him, because he apparently owed the hotel $30 million. And in the 1970s, that's a lot of money. It absolutely caught up to him, because by the time the Colonel died in 1997, he had gambled away his massive fortune, and his net worth ended at just about $1 million. That's what you get, you dirty gambler. Another wild and crazy moment from the film that was factually correct, partly, was the scene where Elvis performed Hound Dog to a hound dog. With Elvis's gyrating moves proving too risque for 1950s America, there was an attempt to introduce a new Elvis. The King came out on NBC television where he sported a black-tailed tux with a bow tie and sang a family-friendly version of Hound Dog to a real dog. Very weird, very awkward. Although this is all portrayed in the film, in the movie it's suggested that the Colonel invented the new Elvis. But in reality, it was NBC who suggested the change. NBC was not a fan of this new rock and roll music, and in order to secure his spot on TV, the change was made. Like in the movie, in real life, Elvis absolutely hated the change. And I'm honestly shocked he did it, because he was a bit of a rebel. A rebel without a cause. Oh yeah. On to one of the more, edgy things in the movie was the depiction of Priscilla Presley. We all know the issue of what really happened with that. And if you don't, allow me to explain. In the movie, and in real life, Elvis enlisted in the army to avoid the public going after his rebellious nature. While he was overseas, he met Priscilla, who was the daughter of one of the officers. In the film, the two were made out to be roughly the same age. Boy, was that inaccurate. In real life, Priscilla was 14, while Elvis was 23. I have no comment. We all know that ain't cool. Anywho, in the movie and in real life, the two spent a lot of time together. And when Elvis returned home, Priscilla went to visit him when she was 17. And when she was 18, she moved to Memphis, Tennessee with Elvis. What's wild about that is that her parents didn't see a problem with this. Yeah, let's move on. This is a bit weird. Later on in the movie, we hear Elvis bring up the fact that he might be starring in a movie, A Star Is Born, alongside Barbra Streisand. This is surprisingly accurate as well. In March 1975, Streisand and her husband and producer John Peters attended one of Elvis's Las Vegas shows. Afterwards, they told him they were making a new adaptation of A Star Is Born, and they would like Elvis to play the Norman Maine role, which is a role of a former star whose career is on the skids as his wife skyrockets to fame. Elvis was reportedly excited about what would have been his most substantial acting role ever, but the Colonel argued that Streisand and Peters would have her interests at heart and not Elvis's. Streisand and Warner Bros. Offered to pay Presley $500,000 plus 10% of the profits after they break even. The Colonel countered by asking for $1 million and 50% from the first dollar, $100,000 in expenses and approval of any song Elvis would perform. Streisand and Peters walked away and offered the role to Chris Christopherson. The Colonel later intimated that Elvis had signed off on the strategy of asking for more than they knew Streisand and Peters would agree to pay. Was he telling the truth? With the Colonel, you never know, that sneaky guy. Elvis's doctor, Dr. Nick, was shown in the movie to be overprescribing the King painkillers, sleeping medication, and what we can assume is morphine to keep the man upright and performing. That is very true, very sad also. The man is often blamed for getting Elvis hooked on prescription pills, which eventually led to his demise. This was accurately portrayed in the movie, and in one scene, Elvis had passed out from exhaustion, and the Colonel gave the signal for the doc to open up his bag and give him some pick-me-up candies, if you get what I'm saying. The King was back on stage in a few minutes. All jokes aside, that is really sad. They treated the poor man like a circus animal, and I don't think the man ever had a chance to rest. And finally, one of the most famous Elvis performances was the 1968 comeback special, which was all portrayed in the movie with only a decent amount of changes than what actually happened in real life. The 68 comeback special was big because it was the first televised performance of Elvis in 7 years. In the film, most of the situation was tweaked for dramatic effect. Elvis met the producers of the show at the Hollywood sign in the movie to plan the comeback, but that is just not true. Also in the movie, they had a whole Christmas set on stage stage for Elvis to perform the Christmas songs to appease some corporate sponsors. That is also not true. The only truth to that was one of the producers wanted at least one Christmas song in the whole special. Most importantly, Robert Kennedy was not killed during the taping like it's portrayed in the movie. But the murders of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy were huge motivators for Elvis to put his heart and soul into the performances. Ladies and gentlemen, the life of Elvis Presley was a wild one. What did you think of Elvis? We think it's a pretty accurate representation of his life. Let us know in the comments below. And as always, everybody, thanks for watching.